Chapter 11. The Silent Shift. Mira leaned against the old wooden fence that lined the training field, arms crossed as she watched Sylvia command the group of younger wolves. Her voice carried easily, sharp and sure, as if she had been leading for years. The sight twisted something in Mira's chest. This used to be her job. Now she was on the outside, watching as Sylvia took everything piece by piece. The pack sensed the shift. Mira could see it in the way their eyes flicked between her and Sylvia during meetings. No one said anything, not to her, not to Zayn. They followed Sylvia's orders without hesitation. Mira's wolf growled softly in the back of her mind. "Take it back. She's not stronger than you." But Mira stayed still. She knew better than to start a fight she wasn't ready to finish. "Luna." Mira turned as Ben, one of the younger pack warriors, approached hesitantly. His eyes darted toward Sylvia, who hadn't noticed him yet. "Shouldn't you be the one leading today?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Mira forced a polite smile. "Not anymore." Zayn thought it was better if Sylvia handled things for now. Ben frowned, shifting his weight. "That doesn't seem right. The pack trusts you." "Zayn made the decision," Mira replied, keeping her tone even. Ben glanced toward Sylvia again, clearly unsure. Mira caught the flicker of his wolf behind his eyes, restless like hers. "Go join the others, Ben," Mira said softly. He hesitated, then gave a quick nod and jogged back to the group. Mira sighed, rubbing her temples as the session continued. Later that afternoon, Mira sat on the back steps of the pack house, staring out at the fading sunlight. Zayn's voice carried from nearby as he and Sylvia walked the perimeter, going over patrol shifts. Mira kept her eyes forward, pretending not to listen. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, eyebrows raising slightly at the name. Adrien, Suna, Ik, Tigyo, Hurst. Claude, Sim, Abigail, Paul Meyer, and Herschel. Mira stared at the message, confusion flickering through her. "Feel what?" Mira typed back quickly. The response came almost immediately. "Zayn's losing control," Adrien answered confidently. "Your pack's weaker. If he doesn't fix it, someone else will." Mira's heart skipped. Her eyes flicked toward Zayn, watching as he leaned in closer to Sylvia, smiling at something she said. Adrien's words felt too true. "What do you expect me to do?" Mira replied. "You already know." Adrien's answer was simple, almost teasing. "You've always been the stronger one." Mira tightened her grip on the phone, chest tightening. "Was I?" Her wolf stirred again, but this time Mira didn't push it down. Mira sat quietly at the far end of the dining hall, pushing food around her plate. Conversations hummed around her, but she barely heard them. At the head of the table, Zayn sat with Sylvia by his side, their heads tilted close as they whispered to each other. It wasn't unusual anymore. Sylvia had practically moved into Zayn's quarters under the excuse of strategic planning. Zayn didn't even try to hide it. The rest of the pack pretended not to notice, but Mira caught their quick glances, the silent discomfort in their eyes. No one said anything. Mira's wolf paced restlessly, growling every time Sylvia leaned in a little too close. "Why are you letting this happen?" her wolf snapped. Mira clenched her fork. Because fighting back meant breaking something she wasn't ready to lose. "You're not eating." Mira looked up to see Ava sliding into the seat across from her, brows knitted in concern. "Not hungry," Mira muttered. Ava glanced toward Zayn and Sylvia, her lips pressing into a thin line. "This isn't right," Ava whispered. "He's humiliating you in front of everyone." Mira let out a slow breath. "I know." "Then why aren't you doing something?" Ava's eyes flickered with frustration. Mira wanted to answer, but the words stuck in her throat. She wasn't sure anymore. Before she could say anything, Sylvia's voice rang out from across the room. "Zayn?" Sylvia said sweetly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Should I move the rest of my things into your room tonight?" The dining hall fell silent. Mira's heart twisted. Zayn barely glanced up from his plate. "Do whatever you need to." Sylvia smiled, casting a glance in Mira's direction, her eyes full of satisfaction. Mira's grip on the fork tightened until her knuckles turned white. Pack members shifted uncomfortably, suddenly finding their plates much more interesting. Ava's gaze burned with anger, but Mira shook her head before she could say anything. "It's fine," Mira whispered, forcing her voice to stay calm. But it wasn't. Not even close. Later that night, Mira stood outside the pack house, breathing in the cool night air. The moon hung low, casting shadows across the yard. Her wolf stirred, restless and uneasy. A familiar scent drifted toward her from the tree line. Adrien. He was close, watching. Mira closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his presence, lingering just beyond the border. She could go to him, but instead she stayed rooted in place, staring out at the dark woods. The soft creak of the door behind her broke the silence. Mira didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "Full moon's coming," Sylvia said casually, stepping beside her. She crossed her arms, eyes glinting under the pale light. Mira said nothing, watching the trees. Sylvia leaned in slightly, voice growled, but she kept her face calm. "Zayn plans to sever the bond by then. He doesn't need it anymore." Mira's wolf growled, but she kept her face calm. Sylvia smiled. "You can feel it too, can't you? The bond's already fading." Mira met her gaze, holding it steady. "You're wrong." Sylvia raised an eyebrow. "Am I?" For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, without another word, Sylvia turned and walked back inside, leaving Mira standing alone beneath the moonlight. Blew itself out of her hands. Her wolf howled softly in the back of her mind. The bond was fading, and for the first time, Mira wondered if she was ready to let it go. Chapter 12. The Weight of Silence. The pack house felt heavier than usual. Every hallway Mira walked through felt colder, every glance from the pack more distant. It wasn't like they pitied her. They just didn't know how to act around someone who was slowly losing everything. Mira sat alone on the back steps, staring at the forest that stretched beyond the border. Mira felt like an outsider, restless and anxious. "Fight back," her wolf growled. "You're stronger than this." Mira clenched her fists, digging her nails into her palms. She could feel it, too, the pull to shift, to let her wolf take over and storm into Zayn's office, to tear down whatever illusion Sylvia had built. But she didn't. The fallout would be worse. Mira's chest ached as memories flooded back, uninvited and painful. She remembered when things were simple, when Zayn used to kiss her forehead every morning before he left to lead patrols, when he used to pull her close by the fire after long days, the bond between them strong and comforting. Now that warmth was gone. It had been replaced by the lingering scent of Sylvia in his room, and the cold way Zayn barely looked at her anymore. Mira shut her eyes, forcing herself to breathe through the ache. Maybe it's already over. Her phone buzzed softly beside her. Mira glanced down. "Adrien, out here. I won't stay long." Mira hesitated. For a moment she thought about ignoring him. But before she could stop herself, she was already standing, heading toward the edge of the woods. Avros. Adrien leaned casually against a tree, arms crossed as the moonlight filtered through the branches. His wolf lingered close to the surface, eyes flickering green when they met hers. "You always come when I call," Adrien said with a faint smirk. Mira rolled her eyes but didn't argue. "Why are you here?" Adrien leaned casually against a tree. "Why aren't you inside with your pack?" Mira looked away. "I needed air." Adrien's gaze lingered on her for a moment. He wasn't buying it. "You're holding back," he said quietly. Mira tensed. Adrien circled her slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Your wolf's ready to fight. I can feel it." "I can't," Mira replied, her voice strained. Adrien stopped in front of her, his eyes narrowing. "Why not?" Mira swallowed hard, struggling to find the words. "If I push too hard, I'll lose what's left." Adrien's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, close enough that Mira could feel the heat of his body against the cool night air. "Maybe that's not a bad thing," Adrien said softly. "Maybe it's time to stop holding on to something that's already broken." Mira met his gaze, her heart racing. Her wolf stirred, leaning into the energy Adrien radiated. It felt different, steady, protective. Adrien lifted his hand slowly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. His touch was light but lingering, and for a second Mira thought he might close the space between them. But he didn't. Adrien's hand dropped to his side, his gaze locking onto hers with quiet intensity. "This isn't my fight, Mira," he whispered. "It's yours." Mira felt the air shift between them as he stepped back. Her wolf whimpered softly, longing for something she wasn't sure she could reach yet. Adrien gave her one last look before disappearing into the woods, leaving Mira standing beneath the stars, her heart heavier than before. Exercised an effort of courage, Mira felt colder than usual as Mira walked along the edge of the pack house. The quiet hum of pack life carried on around her, but she felt distant from it, like she was watching everything from behind glass. It had been days since Adrien's words lingered in her mind. Maybe it's time to stop holding on to something that's already broken. Mira knew he was right. But knowing wasn't the same as doing. She wasn't ready to let go completely. Not yet. Instead, she'd do the next best thing. Fight back. Mira started small. She slipped into Zayn's office late at night, searching through old patrol logs and meeting notes. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, but something inside her told her to keep digging. Sylvia's name appeared more often than it should, mentioned in places where Miras used to be, patrol rotations, border discussions, even resource allocation. It wasn't proof of betrayal, but it was enough to make her wolf growl low beneath the surface. "She's taking over," her wolf warned. Mira pocketed the papers, heart pounding as she slipped back into the hall. She kept moving like nothing had happened, like she wasn't planning to take everything back. Later that day, Mira stood near the forest, phone in hand. She hesitated for only a moment before texting Adrien. "Mira, I'm ready." It didn't take long for his response. "Adrien, knew you would be. Meet me at the border tonight." Mira tucked the phone into her jacket, her heart beating a little faster. By the time the sun had set, Mira was already at the border. Adrien leaned against a tree, arms crossed like he'd been waiting for her all day. "I was wondering how long it'd take," he said, his wolf flashing behind his green eyes. Mira crossed her arms. "Don't gloat. This isn't for you." Adrien smirked, but said nothing. Mira stepped closer, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. "I found something," she admitted, holding out the papers she had taken. Sylvia's name is all over everything. Adrien's eyes darkened as he flipped through them. She's positioning herself to take full control, he said. Zayn's either blind or he doesn't care. He cares, Mira muttered. Just not about me. Adrien glanced at her, his gaze softening. You're stronger than him, Mira. You always were. Mira's wolf stirred at his words, brushing lightly against his. She hadn't meant to let her guard down, but something about Adrien's presence made her wolf calm. For the first time in weeks, she felt steady. We'll confront them at the next pack meeting, Mira said firmly, in front of everyone. Adrien nodded, folding the papers and slipping them into his jacket. I'll back you up. But you need to be ready for whatever happens next. Mira met his gaze, her wolf brushing closer to his again. She could feel the flicker of something else, something new forming between them. I will be, she said quietly. Adrien held her gaze for a second longer, his wolf lingering near hers, before he stepped back. Then let's take your pack back. Chapter 13. Stepping Up. The sun was barely up when the call came in. Rogues near the border. Mira was already halfway to the patrol grounds by the time anyone else reacted. Her heart pounded, but not from fear. This was her chance, her way to remind the pack exactly who she was. By the time she reached the patrol site, a small group of warriors had gathered, murmuring among themselves. Lucas was at the front, his arms crossed as he scanned the tree line. Mira, he asked, surprised. What are you doing here? I'm leading the patrol, Mira replied, pulling her hair into a quick ponytail. Lucas hesitated, glancing toward the others. Zayn didn't say anything about that. I didn't ask, Mira said firmly. Where were the rogues spotted? Lucas raised his eyebrows, but didn't argue. He pointed toward the northern ridge. Scouts saw them near the old cabin. 2, maybe 3 of them. Mira nodded. Let's move. The forest was quiet as Mira led the patrol, the faint sound of footsteps trailing behind her. Her wolf paced beneath the surface, sensing something just out of reach. Lucas kept close, occasionally glancing over at her. You didn't have to come, he said after a while. Mira shrugged. I'm tired of standing on the sidelines, he smiled faintly. It suits you. They found the rogues an hour later, lingering near the edge of the pack's territory. Mira didn't hesitate. With a sharp command, she led the charge, her wolf rising to the surface as they drove the rogues back across the border. It was over in minutes. The pack fell quiet as Mira shifted back, her breathing heavy but steady. Lucas stepped up beside her, nodding in approval. Haven't seen you fight like that in a long time. Mira wiped dirt from her hands, her eyes scanning the group. Some of the younger wolves stared at her with something close to admiration. Good work today, she said, meeting their gazes. We protect our borders. No one forgets that. The pack murmured their agreement, and for the first time in weeks, Mira felt the weight of their loyalty shifting back toward her. By the time they returned to the pack house, Zayn was waiting. His eyes narrowed the second he saw Mira leading the patrol. What were you doing out there? He asked, his voice sharp. Mira met his gaze calmly. Handling it? Zayn's wolf stirred, tension flickering between them. That's not your job anymore. Mira crossed her arms. It used to be. Maybe it still should be. For a moment, Zayn said nothing. The pack watched carefully from behind, shifting awkwardly as the tension grew. Sylvia appeared at Zayn's side, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the group. But before she could speak, Adrien's voice cut through the silence. She did good today, Adrien said, stepping forward from where he had been watching near the tree line. His gaze lingered on Mira, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Better than I've seen in a while." Mira's wolf stirred at his words, brushing lightly against his presence. Zayn's eyes darkened. "Stay out of this." Adrien shrugged. "Just calling it how I see it." Zayn's fists clenched at his sides, but Mira held her ground. As the pack dispersed, Sylvia lingered behind, her eyes fixed on Mira with a look that could cut steel. "She's not as weak as you thought," Sylvia whispered to Zayn, just loud enough for Mira to hear. Mira didn't turn around, but she smiled to herself as she walked away. The tides were turning. The tension in the pack house was thicker than ever. Mira could feel it the second she stepped into the main hall. Wolves who used to greet her with warmth now glanced away, unsure where to stand. At the head of the room, Zayn stood with Sylvia beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The message was clear, too clear. Mira's wolf growled softly, low and steady. Zayn's gaze snapped to her, as if he had been waiting. "Mira," he called out, his voice carrying across the room. "We need to talk." Mira crossed the room slowly, meeting his eyes head-on. She refused to look at Sylvia. Zayn didn't wait for privacy. He raised his chin, making sure every pack member could hear. "It's time you stepped down as Luna." The room went dead silent. Mira's heart slammed in her chest, but she kept her face calm. "She's proven herself capable," Zayn continued, nodding toward Sylvia, "and I believe she'll make a strong Luna. Effective immediately, I'll begin the process of making her my mate." Mira's vision blurred for a moment. Not from sadness, from anger. Her wolf snapped forward, clawing at the surface. "I didn't agree to that," Mira said, her voice sharp and loud enough for the entire room to hear. Zayn's eyes narrowed. "This isn't up for discussion." "I think it is." Mira took a step forward, her wolf brushing against the stunned silence of the pack. "You don't just replace a Luna. That's not how this works, Zayn." Sylvia smirked beside him, but Mira ignored it. Zayn's jaw tightened. "I'm the alpha. I make the decisions for this pack." Mira's wolf surged to the surface, and the air around her shifted. "Not without invoking a challenge," she said, her voice colder now. "Pack law allows me to challenge this decision publicly, so that's exactly what I'm doing." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Zayn's hands curled into fists at his sides. Sylvia's smile faded, her wolf shifting behind her eyes. "You're serious?" Zayn growled. Mira's gaze didn't waver. "Completely." For a moment, neither of them moved. The weight of the challenge hung heavy in the air, crackling like static. Then, out of the corner of her eye, Mira caught a flicker of movement near the tree line outside. Adrien. He stood quietly in the shadows, his green eyes glowing faintly as he watched the confrontation unfold. He didn't step forward, but his presence was unmistakable. Zayn noticed him too. His lips pressed into a thin line, and his wolf bristled with frustration. "Fine," Zayn said finally. His wolf bristled with frustration. "Fine, Zay, if that's what you want, we'll settle this the old way." Mira's heart pounded, but she didn't let it show. She gave a single nod. "I'll be ready." Zayn's glare burned into her, but he said nothing more. As the pack slowly filed out, Sylvia stayed close to Zayn, whispering something in his ear. Mira didn't care. Her eyes drifted back to the tree line, locking onto Adrien's gaze for just a second before he disappeared into the forest. Mira's wolf stirred beneath the surface, ready for whatever came next. She wasn't stepping down, not without a fight. Chapter 14. Torn apart. Mira stood in the center of the pack house, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was full, but no one spoke. All eyes were locked on Zayn, who stood just a few feet away. Sylvia hovered beside him, a smug smile tugging at her lips. Mira's fists clenched at her sides, but she held her ground. "You challenge me," Zayn said coldly, his amber eyes burning into hers. "But this ends now." Mira's wolf growled softly, urging her to fight. Zayn stepped closer, towering over her. "You're not fit to lead this pack," he said, "and I won't let you drag it down any longer." His eyes flickered with something dangerous, and before Mira could react, his hand shot forward, gripping the collar of her shirt and jerking it to the side. "Zayn!" Mira gasped, but his claws had already sliced through the fabric. The room fell into stunned silence as Zayn's claws tore across the mark on her shoulder, the mark that symbolized her role as Luna. Mira bit down hard to keep from crying out as pain shot through her, burning like fire. Our wolf howled inside her, the sound echoing through her mind like a sharp crack. The bond between her and the pack thinned, unraveling piece by piece. Mira staggered back, clutching her shoulder as warm blood trickled down her arm. Zayn stepped away, his expression cold and unflinching. "It's done," he said simply. Sylvia stepped forward, tilting her head as she studied Mira. "You held on longer than I thought," she said with a smirk. "But we all knew this was coming." Mira's breath trembled, but she refused to let them see her break. She straightened slowly, glaring at Sylvia. "This isn't over," Mira growled, her voice rough but steady. Sylvia raised an eyebrow. "It sure looks over to me." Mira turned toward the pack, searching their faces for support, but most avoided her gaze. Some looked guilty, others didn't look at all. Her wolf whimpered, the weight of isolation pressing heavily on her. She stumbled outside, her vision blurred by anger and pain. Adrien found her near the edge of the forest. His eyes immediately fell to the blood staining her shoulder. "Mira." His voice was low, almost a growl. "I'm fine," Mira muttered, brushing past him. Adrien grabbed her wrist gently, stopping her. "You're not fine. I felt it happen." His green eyes darkened with concern. "He severed the bond, didn't he?" Mira didn't answer. Adrien exhaled slowly, loosening his grip. "Come with me," he said. "Leave this behind. You'll be safe in my territory." Mira's wolf stirred, tempted by the offer. Adrien's presence made the pain easier to bear, but something inside her refused to give in. "I'm not running," Mira said, pulling her arm free. Adrien's eyes narrowed. "Staying here is dangerous." Zayn's made his choice. Mira met his gaze, her hazel eyes fierce. "So have I." Adrien studied her for a long moment, then nodded, his wolf brushing softly against hers. "If you change your mind, you know where to find me," Adrien said quietly. Mira turned toward the pack house, blood still trickling down her shoulder. She wasn't leaving. Not until she got back everything they'd tried to take from her. The pack house was quiet, the only sound the faint crackle of the fireplace in Zayn's office. Mira lingered in the hallway, staying in the shadows as she listened to the low hum of voices coming from inside. She hadn't planned on spying, but when she heard Sylvia's voice, something told her to stop and listen. "I don't understand why you're still holding back," Sylvia said softly. Her tone sweet but sharp. "She's not Luna anymore. The pack's already moving on." Mira pressed closer to the door, her heart racing. "I know," Zayn replied, his voice low and tired. "But Mira's been part of this pack for years. I'm not going to throw her out like she's nothing." Sylvia's laugh was quiet, but it carried a sharp edge. Ha! You're too soft, Zayn. That's exactly why this pack needs someone stronger to lead. Mira frowned. What are you saying? Zayn asked, sounding more annoyed than alarmed. Sylvia stepped closer. Mira could hear the shift of her boots on the wooden floor. You'll get full control soon, Sylvia whispered. But once you do, there's no need for you to stick around. Mira's heart froze. What's that supposed to mean? Zayn's voice darkened slightly. Sylvia didn't miss a beat. I'm saying that once you've pushed Mira out completely, maybe I won't need you either. The silence that followed made Mira's wolf bristle. Zayn laughed it off. You'd never do that. Sylvia's voice dropped lower. Wouldn't I? I've worked too hard for this. If you stand in my way, I'll handle you the same way I handled Mira. Mira's breath caught in her throat. She fumbled in her pocket, quickly pulling out her phone. With shaky hands, she hit record and held it close to the door, catching every word. You wouldn't dare, Zayn growled. Try me, Sylvia whispered. Mira's wolf stirred, a fierce sense of satisfaction bubbling inside her. Finally, proof. She slipped away from the door, clutching her phone tightly. As she walked back to her room, her heart pounded, but not with fear. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she had the upper hand, and she was ready to use it. Chapter 15. Cracks in the Armor. Mira sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the phone in her hand. The recording of Sylvia's threat echoed in her head, but instead of feeling victorious, she felt tired. The room felt heavier tonight. The walls seemed closer. Even her wolf, who was usually restless, stayed quiet in the back of her mind. She set the phone down and rubbed her hands over her face. What's the point? Even with the proof, Zayn wouldn't listen. He'd brush it off, call it a misunderstanding. Maybe Sylvia was right. Maybe the pack really did need someone stronger. Just not her. Mira's wolf whimpered faintly, but it felt distant, like it didn't have the energy to argue. Her eyes drifted to the window. The forest stretched just beyond the pack house, dark and quiet beneath the moonlight. She could leave. No one would stop her. Maybe Adrien was right. Maybe it wasn't worth the fight anymore. A soft knock at the door made her sit up straighter. Mira? She knew that voice. Adrien stepped inside, his green eyes scanning the room before landing on her. His expression softened, and for once, the smirk he usually carried was gone. I figured I'd find you like this, he said, leaning against the doorframe. Mira frowned. Like what? Stuck in your head. Adrien crossed his arms. You're thinking about leaving. Mira didn't answer. He stepped closer, stopping just in front of her. I can feel it. Your wolf's quiet. She's tired, Mira muttered. Adrien crouched slightly, meeting her gaze. She's not tired. She's waiting. For what? Mira asked, her voice waiting. For you to stop doubting yourself. Mira let out a bitter laugh. That's easier said than done. Adrien stayed quiet for a moment, studying her carefully. There are wolves here who still believe in you, he said gently. Ava, Lucas, the younger ones who look up to you. They see the Luna you used to be, and they're hoping she'll come back. Mira looked away. What if she doesn't? Adrien tilted his head, his wolf brushing against hers, gentle but steady. Then, maybe it's time for a new Luna to take her place, one who's even stronger. Mira met his gaze, searching for doubt, but found none. As the silence stretched between them, Adrien's wolf pressed closer, and for a second, Mira felt something shift. A spark. Faint, but real. Adrien leaned in slightly, his voice soft. "You feel it too, don't you?" Mira's heart thudded painfully. She did feel it, the strange pull between them, a connection she hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. Adrien's hand brushed lightly against hers, his touch warm. "I think our bond's starting to grow, Mira. You can't keep denying it." Mira pulled her hand back slowly, shaking her head. "I can't. Not yet." Adrien didn't look hurt, but there was something in his eyes that flickered. Something she couldn't name. "I get it," Adrien said, standing up straight. "But when you're ready, you'll know where to find me." Mira watched as he left, her wolf stirring faintly in his absence. The room didn't feel quite as heavy anymore, but as she glanced at the phone on her nightstand, Mira knew one thing for sure. She wasn't leaving. Not yet. The afternoon sun barely warmed the training field as Mira sat alone on the fence, staring at the empty space where pack members usually sparred. The quiet made her feel small, like a ghost in her own home. Her wolf stirred faintly, but even now, the ache of doubt lingered. What if I can't fix this? Mira. She turned to see Lucas walking toward her, his usual easy smile missing. His eyes, warm but serious, met hers as he crossed the field. "I didn't think I'd find you out here," he said, stopping in front of her. Mira shrugged. "Just needed space." Lucas leaned against the fence, arms crossed, as he studied her carefully. "You know, not everyone agrees with what Zayn's doing." Mira glanced at him, unsure where he was going with this. "I haven't seen anyone step in to stop it." "That doesn't mean they don't want to." Mira frowned, but Lucas wasn't done. "A lot of wolves still see you as our Luna," he said, his voice low but steady. "Zayn can try to take your title, but that bond? It's not something he can erase." Mira's heart tightened. Lucas shifted, turning to face her. "I'm not the only one who thinks this way. Ava, Ben, even some of the older warriors, we're still with you." Mira stared at him, the weight of his words settling in her chest. "You're not alone, Mira," Lucas added softly. "We just need you to believe that." Before she could respond, the sound of footsteps approached from the tree line. Adrien, his hands were tucked into his jacket pockets, and he didn't say anything as he walked up, but the way his eyes met Mira's told her he had heard everything. Lucas gave a small nod to Adrien and stepped away, leaving them alone. Adrien watched Lucas disappear into the distance before glancing at Mira. "I told you," he said casually, sitting beside her. "You're stronger than you think." Mira let out a breath, shaking her head. "I don't feel strong." Adrien leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Strength isn't about how you feel, Mira. It's about what you do, even when you feel like falling apart." Mira looked down at her hands, silent. Adrien's voice softened. "You've already survived the worst of this. You're braver than ever, and you're still here. And it's the fact that you're still standing, that's strength." Mira's wolf stirred again, but this time there was no hesitation, only a quiet growl of determination. She straightened slowly, meeting Adrien's gaze. "I'm going to challenge him." Adrien's lips curved slightly. "Good." Mira stood, her heart steady for the first time in weeks. "At the next full moon, I'll make it public. No more hiding." Adrien stood beside her, his wolf brushing against hers for just a second. "I'll be there." The night of the full moon arrived quicker than Mira expected. The pack gathered in the courtyard, the pale light casting long shadows across the open space. Zayn stood at the head of the group, Sylvia by his side, her eyes gleaming with confidence. Mira stepped forward, the weight of the pack's gaze falling on her. Her heart pounded, but she didn't waver. "I challenge Zayn for leadership." Mira's voice echoed across the courtyard. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but Mira didn't look away from Zayn. His eyes narrowed, glowing faintly under the moonlight. Sylvia's smile faltered, and for the first time, Mira saw something flicker in her eyes. Doubt. Mira's wolf pushed forward, ready to fight. She wasn't backing down. Not now. Chapter 16. The Challenge. The moon hung high over the pack house, bathing everything in cold silver light. The courtyard was packed. Wolves stood shoulder to shoulder, their whispers swirling through the air like leaves in the wind. Mira stood near the tree line with Adrien beside her, his presence grounding her. His green eyes scanned the crowd, always watching, always aware. "You sure about this?" Adrien asked, his voice low. Mira nodded, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. "I can't let them take everything from me." Adrien's gaze lingered on her. "I know. Just remember, if you lose, it won't end with losing your title. Zayn won't let you stay in the pack." Mira exhaled slowly. "I know the risks." Adrien stepped closer, his wolf brushing lightly against hers. "Then I'll stand with you, no matter what happens." Mira's chest tightened, but she didn't let it show. "I appreciate that." The sound of heavy footsteps pulled her attention back to the courtyard. Zayn stepped forward, Sylvia close at his side, her chin lifted high like she'd already won. Mira's wolf growled softly, but she kept calm. Zayn's amber eyes locked onto hers as the crowd parted, leaving a wide space between them. "What are you doing, Mira?" he asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. Mira stepped forward, squaring her shoulders. "I'm challenging you for leadership," she said, her voice steady. A ripple of shock spread through the crowd. Wolves exchanged glances, some whispering, while others watched silently. "You're serious?" "Completely." Sylvia leaned toward him, whispering something in his ear. Zayn chuckled, shaking his head as if the thought of her challenging him was ridiculous. "You won't win," Zayn said, crossing his arms. "Step down now, Mira. I'll make sure you keep a place in the pack." Mira's wolf surged forward, pushing against her skin. "I'm not stepping down." Zayn's eyes darkened. For a moment, the playful smirk faded, replaced by something colder. Adrien moved slightly behind Mira, his wolf brimming with energy. "Careful, Zayn," Adrien said quietly, but his words carried across the courtyard. "You underestimate her." Zayn's eyes flicked to Adrien, narrowing. "Stay out of this. This is a pack matter." Adrien's wolf let out a low growl. "I'm part of this now." The tension grew thick, hanging heavily over the gathered wolves. Zayn stared at Mira for a long moment, then finally nodded, his smirk returning. "Fine. I accept your challenge." The crowd shifted nervously. Some wolves stepped back, creating a large circle around the two of them. Sylvia smiled from the sidelines, but something in her eyes flashed with uncertainty. Mira met Zayn's gaze head-on, refusing to let him see her doubt. The full moon glowed overhead, watching silently as the two prepared for the fight that would decide everything. Once before, the pack house was quieter than usual. Mira stood near the training field, watching as a few wolves sparred under the fading afternoon light. Her heart thudded steadily, but the weight of what lay ahead pressed on her shoulders. Adrien leaned against the fence beside her, arms crossed. "You can't take him down alone," he said, not looking at her. "I know," Mira replied, her gaze fixed on the pack members. "Then start gathering the ones who will listen," Adrien continued. "They need to hear the truth, before it's too late." Mira took a deep breath and stepped forward, approaching Lucas first. He wiped sweat from his forehead as he noticed her coming. "Hey, Mira," he said, straightening. "What's up?" "I need to talk to you," Mira said quietly. Lucas's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing the seriousness in her voice. He nodded, waving over Ava, who jogged over to join them. Mira glanced around before speaking. "Zayn's not who you think he is," she started. "Sylvia's been manipulating him, and the pack. I heard her say she plans to take control, even if that means getting rid of Zayn." Ava's eyebrows shot up. "She said that?" Mira nodded. "I recorded it." Lucas exchanged a glance with Ava, his jaw tightening. "I've seen the way she acts. Zayn lets her get away with too much." "He's blinded by her," Mira added. "But if we work together, we can stop this." Ava frowned, shifting uncomfortably. "I don't know, Mira. Challenging Zayn is one thing, but going against both of them? That's dangerous." "I know it is," Mira admitted. "But if Sylvia gets her way, it'll be worse for everyone. This pack deserves better than to be led by someone like her." Lucas's eyes softened. "You're still our Luna, Mira. I'll stand by you." Ava hesitated, then nodded. "Me too." Mira felt a flicker of hope spark in her chest. Later that evening, Mira met Adrien at the border, where his beta, Cade, waited with 3 of Adrien's enforcers. "They'll be nearby during the fight," Adrien said, nodding toward the wolves. "If Zayn tries anything underhanded, we'll step in." Mira eyed the wolves carefully. They were strong, loyal to Adrien. "I don't want this to turn into a war," Mira said quietly. Adrien's gaze soft. "It won't. But I'm not letting you fight alone." Mira gave a small nod, grateful for his support. By the next morning, whispers had already started spreading. Mira caught glimpses of pack members talking in hushed tones, their eyes flicking toward Zayn whenever he walked by. It didn't take long for Zayn to notice. That afternoon, he confronted Mira in the courtyard, his wolf burning just beneath his skin. "You're rallying them against me," he growled. Mira stood her ground. "I'm telling them the truth." Zayn stepped closer, his eyes glowing faintly. "You're making a mistake, Mira." "No," she said calmly. "I'm fixing one." Zayn's fists clenched at his sides, but he said nothing more. He turned sharply, walking away. But Mira knew this wasn't over. As he disappeared into the pack house, Sylvia appeared near the door, watching Mira with narrowed eyes. Mira's wolf stirred, sensing the fight that was just around the corner, and this time she was ready for it. Chapter 17. The Challenge. The moon hung low over the pack house as Wolf gathered for the meeting. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with tension. Mira stood near the edge of the courtyard, her heart steady but her wolf pacing beneath the surface. Tonight was the night. Adrien stood nearby, leaning casually against a tree, but his eyes never left Mira. Lucas and Ava flanked her, quiet but ready. Zayn stood at the center, his arms crossed, with Sylvia standing just a step behind him. She looked too comfortable, too sure of herself. Mira stepped forward, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "I'm challenging Zayn under pack law." The crowd fell silent. Zayn's eyes narrowed as he stared at Mira. "You really want to do this?" Mira nodded. "I do." Sylvia smirked. Zayn stepped forward, his wolf flashing behind his eyes. For a moment, Mira thought he might face her directly, but instead, he turned to Sylvia. "She'll fight for me," Zayn said, tilting his head toward Sylvia. The crowd rippled with confusion. A few wolves exchanged glances, whispering quietly. "You're sending her to fight your battle?" Mira asked, narrowing her eyes. "She's more than capable," Zayn replied coldly. "You wanted a challenge. You've got one." Sylvia stepped forward, her blue eyes gleaming under the moonlight. "I've been waiting for this," she said, her wolf flickering beneath the surface. Mira's wolf growled low, pushing forward eagerly. "Let's get this over with," Mira said, stepping into the center of the courtyard. The pack formed a circle around them as Sylvia shifted, silver fur rippling along her lean frame. Mira felt her own shift begin, bones cracking and fur spreading across her skin until her white wolf stood ready. Sylvia lunged first, but Mira sidestepped quickly, slamming her shoulder into Sylvia's side and knocking her off balance. The pack watched in silence as the two wolves circled each other. Sylvia was fast, but Mira was stronger. Every time Sylvia struck, Mira countered with precision, driving her back step by step. Mira's wolf bared her teeth, pinning Sylvia to the ground with a fierce growl. Sylvia struggled, but Mira's weight held her down. "I've got her," Mira thought, her wolf's instincts buzzing. But before she could land the final blow, a blur of black fur crashed into her side. Mira yelped as she hit the ground hard, rolling to a stop. She lifted her head, blinking away the daze. Zayn stood over her in wolf form, his golden eyes blazing with fury. Gasps erupted from the crowd. "Zayn!" Lucas's voice rang out. "This isn't part of the challenge." But Zayn didn't back down. His wolf's hackles rose as he bared his teeth at Mira, ready to strike again. Mira's wolf growled low, steadying herself. He broke the rules. The fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. The air felt like it crackled as Zayn's black wolf circled Mira, his golden eyes burning with anger. Before he could move, a deep growl echoed across the courtyard. "Adrien!" His tall frame cut through the crowd, his green eyes locked on Zayn. "That's enough," Adrien said, his voice low but sharp. Zayn's wolf snapped his head toward Adrien, teeth bared. But Adrien didn't flinch. "You attacked her during a formal challenge," Adrien continued, stepping forward. "May seem like a secluded puppy dog, but since you like bending rules, let's make this simple." Adrien's wolf stirred beneath his skin, itching to rise. "I'm challenging you to alpha combat, right here, right now." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mira shifted back into her human form, standing tall beside Adrien. Zayn's wolf hesitated for just a second, his eyes flickering between Adrien and Mira. "I don't answer to you," Zayn growled. Adrien's wolf flashed through his eyes. "Denying a challenge from an alpha is a sign of weakness," Adrien said coolly. "Is that the message you want to send?" The pack fell silent. Only Sweet Coal tracked the shiver. Heavy sleep pressed over the pack. Zayn's wolf bristled, but he shifted back, glaring at Adrien with barely contained rage. "Fine," Zayn spat. "You want to fight? Let's do this." Mira stepped closer to Adrien, her shoulder brushing against his. Her wolf pushed forward, strong and steady, as she locked eyes with Zayn. "We do this together," she said softly. Adrien glanced at her, his gaze softening for just a second. "Always." Without another word, Adrien shifted into his wolf, a massive, sleek gray form with piercing green eyes that glowed under the moonlight. Mira's white wolf followed, standing at his side. Zayn snarled and shifted again, lunging at Adrien without hesitation. The two wolves clashed with a thunderous crash, claws and teeth flashing in the pale light. The pack circled around them, watching in stunned silence as Adrien's wolf drove Zayn backward with ease. Zayn fought hard, but Adrien's faster strength saved her, stronger. Every move Zayn made, Adrien countered effortlessly. Mira's wolf paced beside the fight, her eyes locked on Sylvia. Sylvia stood at the edge of the crowd, her eyes narrowing as she watched Zayn struggle. Then, without a word, she turned and disappeared into the trees. Mira growled softly, her instincts screaming that Sylvia wasn't done yet, but she couldn't focus on that now. With a final, powerful strike, Adrien pinned Zayn to the ground, his jaws hovering just above Zayn's throat. Zayn's wolf whined softly, finally yielding. Adrien stepped back, letting Zayn shift slowly, his chest rising and falling heavily as he lay on the ground. The pack watched in silence as Adrien's green eyes flickered toward Mira, his wolf standing tall beside her. The fight was over, but somewhere in the shadows, Sylvia was already planning her next move. Chapter 18. The Final Hunt. Mira's paws hit the ground hard as she ran through the trees, her white fur glowing faintly in the moonlight. Adrien's growl echoed behind her as he kept Zayn pinned, but Mira had no time to look back. Sylvia was gone, and that could only mean trouble. Her wolf's instincts flared, guiding her toward the pack house. Sylvia wouldn't run. Not yet. She wanted this too badly to give up without a fight. Mira slowed as she approached the clearing. The pack house loomed ahead, quiet and still. Too still. Her wolf's ears twitched, sensing movement. She's here. Mira shifted back into her human form, keeping her steps light as she crept toward the entrance. Her breath came in slow, controlled exhales. She stepped through the door, the faint creak of wood echoing behind her. Suddenly, from the shadows, Sylvia lunged. Mira barely dodged in time, stumbling back as Sylvia's claws raked across the doorframe where she had stood. "I knew you'd come," Sylvia hissed, her blue eyes flashing with fury. Her wolf flickered beneath the surface, barely restrained. "You couldn't resist playing the hero." Mira steadied herself, muscles tensed. "I'm not playing anything. You broke pack law and you're going to pay for it." Sylvia laughed bitterly. "Please. Zayn was weak, but I'm not. You think you're the only one fighting for this pack," Mira's wolf growled. "You're not fighting for the pack. You're fighting for yourself." Sylvia's eyes narrowed. Without warning, she shifted, silver fur bursting across her body as she lunged again, aiming for Mira's throat. Mira shifted in response, her white wolf meeting Sylvia mid-air with a clash of teeth and claws. They rolled across the pack house floor, snarling and snapping. Sylvia was faster, but her movements were wild, driven by jealousy and rage. Mira fought with precision, her wolf calm and focused. Sylvia's wolf circled, her lips pulled back in a snarl. She struck again, but Mira sidestepped, slamming her shoulder into Sylvia's side and sending her crashing into the wall. The fight shifted, both wolves breathing heavily as they circled each other. Mira's wolf surged forward, taking Sylvia down with one powerful pounce. She pinned Sylvia to the ground, her teeth hovering over her throat. Sylvia's wolf whined softly, struggling but unable to break free. Mira's wolf hesitated. The instinct to finish the fight was strong, but something held her back. She shifted back into her human form, kneeling over Sylvia as the silver wolf growled beneath her. "Shift," Mira ordered. For a moment, Sylvia didn't move. Then, with a snarl, she shifted back, glaring up at Mira with defiance in her eyes. "I should end this right now," she said, her voice cold. Sylvia's jaw clenched, but she said nothing, Instead of finishing her, Mira slowly stood, releasing her grip. "You're not worth it," Mira said. Sylvia's eyes flashed with confusion. "You're banished," Mira continued, her voice firm. "Leave the pack. If I see you here again, I won't hesitate next time." Sylvia's expression twisted with anger, but there was something else. Fear. A wolf without a pack was nothing. "Get out," Mira said, her eyes narrowing. Sylvia stood slowly, her hands curling into fists. She met Mira's gaze one last time before turning toward the door. Mira watched as Sylvia disappeared into the woods, her heart pounding. The fight was over, and Mira was still standing. The pack gathered under the full moon, their eyes fixed on the center of the courtyard, where Zayn knelt, his head bowed. Adrien stood over him, his wolf still lingering just beneath the surface, ready to strike if necessary. Mira stood beside Adrien, her heart steady. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on her shoulders, but she refused to let it show. Zayn's face was bruised, his pride shattered more than his body. He shifted slightly, glaring up at Mira with burning amber eyes. "You think this makes you stronger?" Zayn growled, his voice rough. "You needed Adrien to fight your battles for you." Mira met his gaze calmly. "I didn't need anyone to expose you, Zayn. You did that yourself." Adrien stepped forward, his tone sharp and cold. "It's over. Relinquish your title, or I'll take it by force." The crowd was silent, waiting for Zayn's response. Zayn gritted his teeth, his fists clenching at his sides. For a moment, Mira thought he might refuse, but then his shoulders slumped. "I, Zayn Blackthorn, relinquish my title as Alpha," he muttered, each word dripping with bitterness. The bond that tied him to the pack weakened instantly. Mira felt it. Like a shift in the air, subtle but powerful. Adrien stepped back, and Mira took his place, standing tall before the pack. "I claim leadership of this pack," Mira said, her voice steady. "If anyone stands against me, speak now." No one moved. The wolves that once followed Zayn stood still, their gazes lowered in respect. Or shame. Zayn rose to his feet, his eyes locked onto Mira's. "You'll regret this," he hissed, his voice just loud enough for the crowd to hear. "You should have finished me when you had the chance." Mira's wolf pushed forward, but she held her ground. "I'm not you, Zayn." He sneered. "That's your weakness." Mira stepped closer, her eyes glowing faintly under the moonlight. "You're leaving this pack tonight," she said coldly. "But not without a reminder of what you did." Adrien nodded, stepping forward and gripping Zayn's shoulder tightly, knew that they didn't die without the order of their destiny. A faint glow shimmered between them, as Adrien's wolf severed the last remaining ties Zayn had to the pack. Zayn's body tensed, his breath hitching as the final connection broke. The mark of a traitor. Zayn staggered back, clutching his shoulder, but the pain wasn't physical. His bond was gone, stripped away. He was nothing now. Without another word, Zayn turned and disappeared into the forest. The pack watched in silence as he faded into the shadows. Mira exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of her new title settle over her. It wasn't over yet. But it was a start. Chapter 19. A new beginning. The night air felt different as Mira stood at the front of the pack house. Wolves filled the courtyard, their eyes locked on her. Some watched with pride, others with quiet doubt. She could feel the weight of their stares, the weight of leadership. Mira took a slow breath, steadying herself. She wasn't just standing here as Luna. She was standing as Alpha. Adrien stood a few feet behind her, his presence calm but powerful. His green eyes flickered with something she couldn't quite place. Pride, maybe, or something more. Mira stepped forward, lifting her chin. "We've been through a lot," she began, her voice carrying through the crowd. "And I know change isn't easy, but this pack deserves better than what we've been given." The wolves listened, some nodding while others stayed still. "I won't promise to fix everything overnight," Mira continued, "but I will promise to fight for this pack, to protect it, to lead it, and to make sure no one is left behind." Lucas and Ava stood near the front, both offering small smiles of support. From the back, an older warrior stepped forward. "We follow you, Mira," he said simply. His words rippled through the crowd, and soon after, others nodded in agreement. But Mira didn't miss the way a few wolves lingered in silence, doubt still flickering behind their eyes. She could sense it. Some still weren't sure if she was ready. And maybe part of her wasn't sure either. After the meeting, the crowd began to thin, returned to their homes, leaving Mira alone near the steps of the pack house. Adrien approached quietly, standing beside her, as they watched the last few wolves disappear into the night. "You handled that well," Adrien said, breaking the silence. Mira gave a small shrug. "I'm not sure everyone thinks so." "They'll come around," Adrien replied. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer. "You're stronger than Zayn ever was." "Adrien," Mira started, but he cut her off gently. "I know," he said, with a faint smile. "You're not ready to make that choice. Not yet." Mira looked away, unsure of how to respond. Adrien leaned in slightly, his voice soft near her ear. "But when you are, I'll be here." He stepped back, giving her space as he started toward the tree line. Mira watched him disappear into the woods, her heart pulling in two directions. She was Alpha now. But she wasn't sure if she was ready for anything more. The morning sun warmed Mira's face as she stood on the pack house steps, watching the wolves below her. The courtyard buzzed softly with quiet conversation, but the tension that had hung over the pack for so long was finally gone. Zayn was no longer here. Mira inhaled deeply, letting the crisp air fill her lungs. For the first time, she felt free. No more whispers behind her back, no more doubting every move she made. She was Alpha now. Lucas approached from the training field, nodding respectfully. "The patrols are set for the week, Mira. Let me know if you want any changes." Mira smiled. "Good work, Lucas. I trust your judgment." He dipped his head slightly before heading back, and Mira caught the faint flicker of pride in his eyes. It was subtle, but she could feel it. The pack's trust growing stronger. Piece by piece, she was reshaping the leadership that Zayn had let fall apart. "You're settling into this nicely," Adrien's voice broke through her thoughts. Mira turned to see him leaning casually against the fence, his green eyes watching her closely. His presence had become more familiar over the past few days, and her wolf stirred slightly at the sight of him. "I'm figuring it out," Mira said, crossing her arms. "It's not easy." Adrien smiled. "It's not supposed to be." He stepped closer, his gaze softening. "You've done more than just take control of this pack, Mira. You've earned their respect. And mine." Mira felt her heart beat a little faster. Adrien held her gaze for a long moment before speaking again. "I meant what I said before," he said quietly. "Come with me, join my pack, be my mate." Mira's breath caught, and for a second, she didn't know what to say. Adrien's wolf brushed against hers gently, offering warmth and safety. "You don't have to decide now," he added, sensing her hesitation. "But I want you to know the offer still stands." Mira looked away, staring out at the forest in the distance. Part of her wanted to say yes, to leave the memories of this place behind and start over, but another part wasn't ready. She turned back to Adrien, her voice soft but steady. "I need time." Adrien nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." As he walked away, Mira felt the weight of the decision hanging in the air. Her heart might be leaning toward Adrien, but for now, she would stand on her own. Chapter 20. Under the Moonlight. The moon hung low in the sky, casting silver light over the pack house. Mira stood on the balcony, arms resting on the railing as she watched the forest stretch out in front of her. The soft hum of crickets filled the air, but her mind was quiet for once. Everything felt different now. The weight of leadership pressed against her shoulders, but it wasn't the same as before. This time, it felt right. Like she belonged here. Mira's eyes drifted over the pack grounds below. Wolves moved in the distance, some patrolling, others laughing softly by the fire. There was peace tonight, a peace she hadn't felt in months. Behind her, the door creaked open. "I thought I'd find you out here," Adrien said, stepping onto the balcony. His footsteps were light, but Mira's wolf had sensed him long before he spoke. She glanced at him, offering a small smile. "Couldn't sleep." Adrien leaned against the railing beside her, his green eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Figured. A new alpha has a lot to think about." Mira exhaled softly. "I guess so." They stood in silence for a while, the cool breeze brushing past them. Adrien didn't rush to fill the quiet, and Mira appreciated that. "You've come a long way," Adrien said eventually, his voice low. "Your pack trusts you now, and you trust yourself." Mira's gaze stayed on the trees. "I wasn't sure I could do this," she admitted, "but I think I'm starting to believe it." Adrien smiled, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "You should." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rustle of leaves in the wind. Adrien shifted closer, his arm lightly brushing against hers. The warmth of his presence stirred something inside her, and her wolf didn't resist. He turned slightly, his gaze locking onto hers. Mira's heart thudded softly in her chest as Adrien leaned in, closing the space between them. Mira didn't pull away. The soft glow of the moon wrapped around them, and in that quiet moment, the weight she carried didn't feel so heavy. Maybe she wasn't ready to choose her future yet. But tonight, she let herself enjoy this. Whatever it was. Under the moonlight. The sun dipped low over the blackthorn pack as wolves gathered in the clearing. The air felt alive, buzzing with excitement and pride. For the first time in a long while, the pack felt whole. Mira stood at the front, her heart racing but steady. She wore a simple black cloak draped over her shoulders, the silver pendant of the pack resting just above her heart. This wasn't the life she imagined months ago, but now it felt like the life she was meant to live. Adrien stood a few feet away, his gaze never leaving her. Lucas stepped forward, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Tonight, we crown Mira as the alpha of the Blackthorn pack." A wave of howls echoed through the air, filling Mira's chest with warmth. Ava grinned proudly from the front, and even some of the older wolves who had doubted her stood with their heads bowed in respect. Lucas turned toward Mira, holding out a ceremonial dagger. Mira took it carefully, the metal cool in her hand. Mira nodded, gripping the dagger tightly. "I pledge to protect and lead this pack as my family. From this day forward, I will stand as Alpha of Blackthorn." A hush fell over the crowd before the pack erupted into cheers and howls. Mira felt her wolf rise within her, proud and strong. She had made it. As the ceremony ended, Mira stepped away from the crowd, letting the excitement settle. She wandered toward the edge of the clearing, where Adrien was already waiting for her. "You looked good up there," Adrien said, smirking. "Alpha Mira has a nice ring to it." Mira laughed softly. "I'm still getting used to it." Adrien stepped closer, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "You'll do just fine." His voice was low, and there was something soft in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. Mira felt her heart flutter. "I couldn't have done this without you." Adrien smiled but shook his head. "You could have, but I'm glad I was here anyway." For a moment they stood in silence, the cool breeze rustling the trees around them. Mira felt Adrien's hand brush against hers, and this time she didn't hesitate. She laced her fingers with his, letting the warmth between them settle her nerves. Before either of them could speak, Lucas jogged toward them, his expression tense. "Mira," he called, stopping just short of the tree line. Scouts caught wind of rogue activity near the northern border. Mira's grip on Adrien's hand tightened slightly. "Rogues?" Lucas nodded, "and there's something else." He paused, lowering his voice. "They caught Sylvia's scent." Adrien's jaw tensed, but Mira exhaled calmly. "Let her come," Mira said, lifting her chin. "She won't get far." Lucas nodded and jogged back toward the scouts. Adrien glanced at Mira, his hand still holding hers. "You really are ready for this," he said, a spark of admiration in his voice. Mira smiled softly. "Yeah, I think I am." As they walked back toward the pack house, Mira felt lighter than she had in months. The weight of the past had finally lifted, and in its place, a new future stretched ahead. One she was ready to embrace, no matter what came next. She knew she wasn't facing it alone. The sun filtered gently through the trees, casting warm, golden light across the Blackthorn Pack's lands. Laughter echoed from the training field, where young wolves chased each other, their playful growls filling the air. The pack house stood tall behind them, stronger than ever. Mira watched from the balcony, a soft smile tugging at her lips. It had been months since she took the title of Alpha, and each day brought new challenges, but also new hope. The pack thrived under her leadership, and she could feel the bond between them strengthening with each passing season. Footsteps sounded behind her, but she didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "You're smiling again," Adrien said, leaning casually against the railing beside her. His green eyes glowed softly in the sunlight, and his wolf's energy brushed against hers like a steady breeze. "Don't get used to it," Mira teased. "I'm still in charge here." Adrien smirked. "I wouldn't dare forget." Their wolves brushed against each other, the connection undeniable. Adrien hadn't pushed her to choose him, but the bond between them had grown stronger every day. Mira wasn't afraid of it anymore. "You've done well," Adrien said after a moment, his tone softer. "The pack's happy. They trust you." Mira looked down at the wolves training below. Lucas and Ava led them, their leadership cemented as Mira's most trusted betas. Everything felt right. "They should be happy," Mira said, glancing back at Adrien. "We've been through enough." Adrien nodded, then his expression shifted, more playful. "I mean, technically, I helped a little." Mira laughed. "I'll make sure to mention you in the history books." Before Adrien could respond, a small pup raced across the clearing, tumbling over his feet. He yipped excitedly as his siblings chased him, and Mira couldn't help but chuckle. For the first time in a long while, the future felt bright. Adrien slipped his hand into hers, and Mira didn't pull away. "Whatever comes next," Adrien said, his voice low, "we'll face it together." Mira squeezed his hand gently, letting the warmth of his presence settle in her chest. "Yeah," she whispered, watching the pack she had fought so hard to protect. Together. That's how they'd face the future. And this time, Mira knew, no matter what lay ahead, they would thrive.